At the restaurant, my sister Kelsey announced to everyone, "Get out of here. Go find another table. This one's for family, not adopted girls." They laughed in unison, nodding along as if it were a punchline instead of a declaration. Moments later, the waiter placed a leather folder in front of me, the bill for the entire engagement dinner, $2,400. I smiled politely, lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and paid it without comment. The card reader chimed, approved. That's when Kelsey shrieked, "Just a moment, please," before I explain exactly how I made them regret those words. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The wind on the rooftop terrace sliced through my coat, but I didn't register the cold. I felt calibrated, precise. Behind the glass walls of the lounge, my adoptive family lifted champagne flutes in celebration. My father, David, threw his head back, laughing at something my mother, Christina, murmured into his ear. My sister, the glowing bride-to-be, beamed, her manicured hand resting possessively on the arm of her wealthy fiancé. They looked effortless, carefree, secure. Mostly because I had just funded every ounce of it. The receipt was still warm between my fingers, $2,400, the cover charged to a life I was never actually invited to live. Kelsey tapped her spoon against her glass again. The chatter died down. She smoothed the silk of her dress and looked straight at me through the glass, her smile tight, dismissive. Then she flicked her wrist in a shooing motion, like I was a stray that had wandered too close to the hors d'oeuvres. "Sydney," she mouthed slowly, exaggerating each syllable so I couldn't miss it. "You ruin the aesthetic." My mother nodded in agreement, turning her back on me to fuss with Kelsey's veil. They didn't wait to see if I'd leave. They never did. They assumed compliance. That was the arrangement. I paid, they enjoyed. I disappeared until the next bill surfaced. I looked down at the receipt. It wasn't just proof of payment. It was a contract, and I had finally decided to break it. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I folded the receipt neatly, slipped it into my pocket, and walked toward the elevator. The transaction was complete, so were we. The elevator doors slid closed, sealing off the celebration. The silence inside the metal box was dense but not lonely. It felt protective. I pulled my phone from my clutch. My screen lit up instantly with a message from my mother. "Christina, you embarrassed us. Where are you going?" I didn't respond. I didn't explain. I tapped the information icon next to her name and selected block caller. Then I did the same for my father, David, and finally for Kelsey. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my digital world was as quiet as the physical one. I flagged down a cab and gave the driver my address. As the city lights smeared past the window, I allowed myself to dissect the last 5 years with clinical honesty. People love asking why victims of financial abuse stay. They assume weakness. Stupidity, naivety. I was none of those. I was an architect. I understood structure, load, and stability better than most people ever would. But I had fallen into the oldest psychological trap there is, the sunk cost fallacy. For years, I treated my adoptive family like a slot machine. Every bill I covered, every emergency I absorbed. Every disaster I quietly fixed with my own savings. I fed another coin into the machine. I convinced myself that if I just paid enough, someday the lights would flash, the bells would ring, and love would finally spill out. Tonight, staring at that receipt, I finally understood the truth. The machine wasn't overdue for a payout. It wasn't broken. It was rigged. There was no jackpot, only an endless, hungry slot designed to take until I was empty. Paying that bill upstairs wasn't submission. It was the final coin I was willing to lose, proof, once and for all, that the game itself was the problem. When I unlocked my apartment door, the air inside was still and clean. My space was minimalist, intentional, the opposite of the loud, expensive chaos of my parents' house. I didn't remove my coat. I went straight to my desk and opened my laptop. I didn't need to search. I knew exactly where the file lived, the ledger. I'd started it 5 years ago, not out of spite, but desperation. A way to track where my salary was bleeding out, I scrolled to the top. First entry 5 years ago. Brandon's transmission repair, $1,200. Liquidity issues, my father had said. I paid. Kelsey's tuition supplement, $4,000. David's back taxes, $8,500. Christina's medical emergency spa retreat, $3,000, row after row, column after column. At the bottom, a single massive total stared back at me. I had bankrolled their lifestyle while living in a studio and shopping discount aisles. I had been their safety net, their venture capitalist, their retirement plan, all while they introduced me as our independent daughter, with a tone that implied emotional distance instead of survival. They called me cold because I worked hard enough to afford the warmth they felt entitled to steal. I stared at the blinking cursor. This file was no longer a personal record, it was evidence. I hit print, the printer roared to life, its mechanical rhythm steady and relentless. Page 1, page 2, page 3, 12 pages total, 12 pages of exploitation. I lifted the stack, it was warm. Heavy, tangible, for the first time my sacrifice had weight. I placed it beside the receipt from the engagement dinner. The audit was finished, collection would come next. I woke the following morning not to sunlight, but to my phone vibrating angrily on the nightstand. It had been buzzing all night, an insect trapped behind glass. The lock screen was flooded. Missed calls, voicemails, messages from neighbors and family friends I hadn't spoken to in years. My mother had bypassed the block using the neighbor's phone. 7:04 a.m. Sydney, this is selfish and dramatic even for you. Your father is sick with worry. We need that credit card for the venue deposit today. Apologize and come back, or don't bother coming for Christmas. You are destroying this family. Selfish, dramatic, destroying the narcissist's holy trinity. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the deposit. The family they accused me of destroying was really just their financial ecosystem, and I had removed the keystone species. I didn't respond. The familiar panic didn't come, no urge to fix it. No apology forming, only calm. I swiped the notification away and opened Instagram. Kelsey had been busy. She deposted a photo from the engagement party. A group shot, my parents, Kelsey, her fiancé, and my brother Brandon, all laughing, champagne flutes raised. Caption, so grateful to be surrounded by real family who supports me unconditionally. Sad, some people choose jealousy over joy, but we won't let negativity ruin our blessings. Family first, blessed. Real love. The comments poured in. You deserve the world, ignore the haters. So happy for you, history was being rewritten in real time. I was the bitter spinster, the jealous outsider. The narrative they'd planted for years was finally bearing fruit. Sydney the workaholic. Sydney the cold one, Sydney the outsider. Now they were harvesting it. I sat at my kitchen island, coffee warming my hands, staring at the ledger. 12 pages of undeniable truth. A message came through from a burner app. Brandon, yo, Dad's freaking out. Just send the card info so he can pay the vendor. Stop being a psycho. I sipped my coffee slowly. I remembered the last time he'd called me a psycho, right before I paid his parking tickets anyway, because family helps family. Not today. I slid the ledger into my leather portfolio. I dressed in my sharpest suit, charcoal gray, severe lines. I wasn't dressing for reconciliation. I was dressing for war. I stepped into the morning light. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it. Let them scream into the void. I had the receipts, and I was done paying the bill. My architecture firm rose like a fortress of glass and steel in the financial district. It was the one place in my life governed by logic and physics, but today the air in the lobby felt charged. Sitting on a Barcelona chair, utterly out of place and completely in control, was my great Aunt Catherine. My steps slowed for half a second. In my adoptive family's mythology, Catherine was the villain, the cold, wealthy widow who abandoned them to hoard her fortune. My mother called her a witch. My father refused to speak her name. I hadn't seen her since I was 10, but I recognized the posture. She sat with aspen of steel, dressed in a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than my first car. She saw me, she didn't smile. She didn't wave, she simply stood up, picking up a thick leather-bound file folder from the seat beside her. Sydney, she said, her voice was like dry ice. We need a room somewhere without ears. I didn't ask why she was here. I didn't ask how she knew where I worked. I simply nodded and led her past the receptionist scanning my badge to open the secure doors. We walked in silence to Conference Room B, a soundproof glass box overlooking the river. I closed the door. Hello, Aunt Catherine, don't waste time on pleasantries, she said, placing the heavy file on the mahogany table. I saw what happened last night. The rooftop, the bill, the exit. I stiffened. How you weren't there? I have eyes everywhere, Sydney. I've been watching you for 11 months. The confession hung in the air. I looked at her. Really looked at her and realized that the coldness my family complained about wasn't malice. It was precision. It was the same look I saw in the mirror. Why? I asked. If you've been watching, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you help me when I was paying for Brandon's car or Kelsey's tuition? Catherine sat down, folding her hands over the file. Because you weren't ready. This was the perspective of the silent witness. She explained that she had tracked the financial abuse for years. She knew about the emotional blackmail. She knew about the exclusion, but she also knew the psychology of the victim. If I had intervened 6 months ago, Catherine said, her voice steady and factual, you would have defended them. You would have said they were struggling. You would have used my money to bail them out again. I couldn't save you, Sydney. You had to save yourself first. You had to be the one to walk away from the table. She tapped the file with a manicured fingernail. Last night, you finally cut the cord. You stopped the transaction. That means you are finally ready to see what I have in here. I looked at the folder. It was thick, stuffed with documents. What is it? I asked. Proof, Catherine said. Your mother told you that your birth parents died penniless. She told you that she and David took you in out of the goodness of their hearts despite the financial burden. Yes, I said. They remind me of it every Christmas. Catherine's eyes flashed with a sudden terrifying anger. It was the only crack in her armor. Lies, she hissed. Your parents didn't leave you nothing, Sydney. They left you everything. And for 25 years, Christina and David haven't just been using you, they have been stealing from you. She slid the file across the table. Open it. I opened the file. The first page wasn't a bank statement. It was a letter yellowed with age written in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was dated 25 years ago, 2 weeks before my birth parents died in the car accident that redefined my existence. To our daughter, Sydney, so you will always have a foundation. Below it was a bank statement from the year I turned 18. The balance wasn't zero. It was $1,400,000. The air in the conference room seemed to vanish. I couldn't breathe. My mother, Christina, had drilled a specific narrative into my head since I was old enough to understand money. She told me my birth parents were irresponsible dreamers who died with mountains of debt. She told me that she and David had taken me in at great personal financial risk, that raising me was an act of charity that nearly bankrupted them. It was the guilt I had carried my entire life. It was the reason I paid their bills without question. They lied, I whispered. The words felt heavy like stones dropping into deep water. They didn't just lie, Catherine said, her voice sharp and precise. She reached over and turned the page to a legal document. It listed Christina as the trustee and Catherine as the original executive. I set this trust up with your father, Catherine said. I was supposed to watch over it. But when you were 7, David came to me with tears in his eyes. He showed me documents, forged documents I know now, claiming the entire fund had been wiped out by bad investments during the market crash. They told me there was nothing left. They told me they were struggling to feed you. Catherine's hand clenched into a fist on the mahogany table. I believed them. I stepped back. I let them play the martyrs because I thought they were actually sacrificing to raise you. I didn't know I was leaving the fox in charge of the hen house. I flipped through the pages. The file was a forensic autopsy of my stolen life. I saw the withdrawal records. They weren't for my education or my health care. Withdrawal $12,000, Kelsey's private school tuition. Withdrawal $55,000, David's consulting business capital. Withdrawal $8,000, family vacation Disney World. I remembered that vacation. They went when I was 12. They left me with a neighbor because they said they couldn't afford a ticket for me. I sat in Mrs. Higgins' living room for a week thinking I was a burden while they spent my inheritance on mousers and hotel suites. I turned to the most recent page. The transaction was dated 3 days ago. Withdrawal $25,000, Venetian rooftop deposit. The world tilted on its axis. I hadn't just paid the $2,400 bar tab last night. I had paid for the entire engagement party, the venue, the flowers, the champagne. It was all funded by the ghosts of the parents who actually loved me. Christina and David hadn't just used me as an ATM. They had cannibalized my future to feed their golden child. I looked up at Catherine. The shock was gone. In its place was a cold, vibrating rage that felt like an engine turning over. They stole $1 million from an orphan. I said it wasn't a question. With interest and market growth, Catherine corrected. They stole nearly $3 million and they are still doing it. They think the well is bottomless. She reached into her purse and pulled out 2 envelopes. They were thick, cream-colored, and sealed with the wax emblem of her high-powered law firm. This, she said, tapping the first envelope, is a cease and desist order freezing every asset they own. This, she tapped. The second is a criminal complaint for embezzlement and fraud. She looked at me, her eyes matching mine, hard, dark, and unforgiving. They are hosting a brunch this morning, Catherine said, at the country club to celebrate the engagement. I stood up. I didn't need to ask where the money for the brunch came from. I closed the file. Let's go, I said. I think it's time we crash the party. The country club brunch was a sea of pastel linens and forced laughter. From the entryway, I watched them. My family was holding court at the center table, surrounded by extended relatives and Kelsey's future in-laws. My father, David, was standing with a mimosa in hand midway through a toast about the sanctity of family support. The irony was so thick I could taste it metallic and bitter. Beside me, Great Aunt Catherine adjusted her silk scarf. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield she had already wired for demolition. Ready? She asked. Let's burn it down, I said. We walked in, the silence spread outward from the door like a shock wave, heads turned, glasses lowered. When my mother Christina saw us, her smile curdled into a mask of panic. She stood up too quickly, her chair screeching against the marble floor. Sydney, she hissed, rushing toward us to intercept the scene before it reached the head table. What are you doing here? You were uninvited and bringing her. This is a private event. It's not a private event, Christina Catherine said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. It's a crime scene. The room went dead silent. David froze his glass halfway to his mouth. Kelsey looked up from her plate of fruit, her eyes darting between me and the thick envelope in Catherine's hand. Don't cause a scene, Christina whispered, her eyes manic. We can talk later, just leave. No, I said, my voice was calm. It was the voice I used when telling a contractor a load-bearing wall was failing. We're done talking. We're here to serve notice. Catherine stepped past my mother and walked straight to the head table. She didn't yell, she didn't throw a drink. She simply placed the legal documents on the white tablecloth right next to the floral centerpiece I had unknowingly paid for. David, Christina Catherine said, these are notices of a federal lawsuit for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. As of 9:00 this morning, your assets have been frozen. The house, the accounts, the business capital, all of it. David dropped his glass, its shattered orange juice and champagne splashing onto his Italian loafers. You can't do that, he stammered. That money, we raised her. It was reimbursement. We took her in when no one else would. You didn't take me in, I said, stepping forward. You took my trust fund in. I was just the packaging. The guests were murmuring now. I saw Kelsey's fiancé, a man who cared deeply about optics, slowly pull his hand away from hers. Kelsey sensed the shift. She looked at her parents, panic rising in her chest like rising water. Frozen, Kelsey asked, her voice shrill, what does that mean? What about the wedding payments? The vendor checks go out tomorrow. There are no checks, Kelsey, I said. The well is dry, but the money Kelsey spun on our mother. You said there was plenty. You said the trust was practically infinite. Christina lunged for her daughter, trying to shush her, but it was too late. The pressure was too high and the structure was too weak. Kelsey shoved her hand away and stood up. Her face twisted in a tantrum of pure entitlement. You told me it was my money, Kelsey screamed. The sound tore through the room. You told me Sydney was just the help. You said her parents left it for us because they owed you. The confession hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. She knew. All this time, the golden child knew exactly where the gold came from. She hadn't just been spoiled, she had been complicit. I looked to my left. The wedding videographer hired to capture candid family moments was standing 10 ft away. His camera was raised. The red recording light was steady and unblinking. He had it all, the fraud, the confession, the collapse. Christina looked at the camera, then at her wealthy future in-laws, who were staring at her with expressions of absolute horror. She realized in that second that her social currency had just been devalued to zero. It's a misunderstanding, David tried, his voice cracking. We can explain. You can explain it to the district attorney, Catherine said. We've already filed the criminal complaint. I looked at them one last time, my mother trembling in her designer dress, my father broken and small, my sister sobbing not for the crime but for the loss of her budget. They looked like strangers. Come on, Aunt Catherine, I said, turning my back on the wreckage. I have a new life to build. We walked out the way we came, leaving the silence behind us. I didn't look back. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted. By Monday morning, the video of Kelsey's screaming confession had been leaked, not by me, but by one of the guests who realized the perfect family narrative was a lie worth exposing. It went viral within hours. The internet didn't see a bride under stress. They saw a spoiled accomplice furious that her stolen lifestyle had been repossessed. David and Christina were indicted 2 weeks later. The charges included wire fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Because the amounts crossed state lines and involved banking institutions, the federal prosecutors were involved. They faced years in prison, not weeks. Kelsey's fiancé left her before the ink was dry on the cancellation checks. He issued a public statement about misrepresented values and disappeared back into his own wealthy, scandal-free world. Without the trust fund to prop her up, Kelsey had nothing, no career, no husband, and no reputation. I sat in my new office 3 months later. It was a space I had designed myself. Clean lines, natural light, structural integrity. On my desk were the plans for the foundation, a community center for foster youth funded entirely by the Recovered Trust. I was no longer building on sand, I was building on bedrock. I thought about the metaphor of the paper house. My family had built a beautiful, enviable life. From the outside, it looked perfect. The parties, the clothes, the status, but it was all just paper walls held up by the money they stole from me. They had spent 20 years painting the paper to look like marble, convincing the world it was solid. But the moment I pulled my support, the moment I stopped being the load-bearing wall, they abused the entire structure collapsed. It had no foundation, it had no truth. Great Aunt Catherine walked in carrying 2 coffees. She set one down on my drafting table. She was my partner, now helping me manage the trust she had originally created, ready for the site visit. She asked, always, I said. I picked up my phone, 0 missed calls from my mother, 0 texts from my father. They were allowed 1 call a week from the detention center, and they used it to call lawyers, not me. I smiled a genuine, easy smile that reached my eyes. I turned off my phone and slid it into my drawer. The transaction was finally permanently closed. If you've ever felt like you were paying for a seat at your own family's table, share this story. Remind the world you are not a bank account, you are the prize.